She slid the divorce papers across the table with a smirk, certain she'd humiliate me in front of everyone. The room held its breath, waiting for me to break, to beg, to crumble. Instead, I calmly picked up the pen, signed my name without hesitation, and then turned to her lover. I placed the papers neatly in front of him and said, "Now it's your responsibility." The laughter that had been aimed at me flipped in an instant, echoing around the restaurant, and I watched as her face drained of color. She thought she was making me the joke, but in that moment, the entire room knew who the real fool was. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. The evening had started like a performance, every detail arranged to impress. We were seated at a long table in one of the finest restaurants in the city, chandeliers glowing overhead, the murmur of conversations blending with the faint sound of a piano in the background. Waiters glided between tables with bottles of wine and plates dressed like works of art. The air smelled faintly of roasted lamb, garlic, and truffle. The guests at our table were polished, dressed to perfection, their laughter sharp and bright, the kind of laughter that carried more judgment than joy. My wife, Rebecca, had orchestrated the dinner. She loved these gatherings. The attention, the subtle competition, the way she could hold court with a well-timed joke or cutting remark. I sat beside her in my black suit, my tie slightly loosened, my posture straight but not rigid. I'd learned long ago that in rooms like this, stillness could be more powerful than words. Across from us sat Ethan, the man who had been her business friend for months, his hand always lingering a fraction too long when passing her a glass, his laugh just a bit too loud at her jokes. Tonight, she didn't bother hiding it. She leaned toward him, her hand brushing his arm, her eyes sparkling in a way they hadn't for me in years. And I let her. Around the table, people noticed. They weren't blind. Their glances were quick, their whispers soft, but the tension was thick enough to taste. My face betrayed nothing. I ate in silence, lifted my glass when appropriate, and let the show unfold. Rebecca thrived on spectacle. She wanted me to react, to show weakness, to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had the upper hand. But I sat still, steady, every muscle in control. My calm unnerved her more than any outburst ever could, and I could see it in the tightness of her smile when she glanced my way. She wanted me broken, not composed. She wanted a scene, not silence. And so she decided to create one herself. She reached into her purse, her manicured fingers pulling out a crisp envelope. She slid it across the white linen table with a deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving mine. "I think it's time we make this official," she said, her voice loud enough to hush the conversations around us. The envelope stopped in front of me. I knew what it was before I even touched it. Divorce papers. Around the table, forks paused midair. Glasses hovered, untouched. The silence was instant, sharp, as if the whole restaurant had leaned in at once. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her smirk wide and cruel. Ethan chuckled softly beside her, giving me a look of mock sympathy, as though he had already won. I didn't move right away. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment press down on every guest watching. My heartbeat was steady, my breathing even. I reached for the envelope slowly, slid the papers out, and placed them flat on the table. Rebecca's smirk grew. She thought she had me cornered. But she didn't know that silence could be louder than any scream, and calm could be sharper than any blade. The papers lay flat on the linen, the sharp black ink of the legal text almost gleaming under the soft golden lights. Everyone's eyes were on me, waiting for the explosion, the shouting, the denial, maybe even a desperate plea for her to reconsider. I felt their anticipation like static crawling through the air, and I could see Rebecca's posture stiffen slightly as the seconds ticked by and I didn't take the bait. She wanted a spectacle, but what she was about to get was something entirely different. I picked up the pen that the waiter had left earlier beside my glass. My hand didn't tremble. In fact, the steadiness of my movements seemed to unsettle more than any display of anger could have. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was faint, but in that silent room it echoed like thunder. People leaned closer, some covering their mouths, some pretending to look away while their eyes stayed fixed. I could feel the heat of Rebecca's gaze on me, her smirk faltering for the first time, as though she hadn't expected me to be so calm, so ready. I signed my name with a flourish, laid the pen down gently, and slid the papers back across the table, not to her, but to Ethan. His laugh died in his throat when the documents landed in front of him. He looked confused, glancing between me and Rebecca, as if he had suddenly been handed a bomb he had no idea how to defuse. "Now it's your responsibility," I said evenly, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. No anger, no desperation, just cold, measured certainty. The words hung there, heavy and undeniable, and then the dam broke. Laughter erupted. Not cruel laughter aimed at me, but a sharp, biting laughter that turned and wrapped itself around Rebecca and Ethan like chains. A few guests tried to stifle it, but they couldn't. The absurdity of the moment was too much. Rebecca's smirk vanished completely, her face drained of color, her jaw tightening, her eyes darting around the table, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But there was no rescue. The tide had turned, and the humiliation she had prepared for me was now devouring her whole. Ethan fumbled with the papers, his hands clumsy, his expression caught between shock and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked less like the suave, confident man she had flaunted and more like a deer frozen in headlights. The guests watched it unfold like a play, their whispers now buzzing openly, some shaking their heads, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever, and lifted my glass. The wine caught the light as I swirled it slowly, the deep red gleam a perfect contrast to the pale look on Rebecca's face. I raised the glass in her direction, my eyes locked on hers, and sipped. I didn't need to say another word. My silence was deafening. My composure was victory. My lack of outrage was the knife that cut deepest. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, the confidence that had radiated from her earlier now completely shattered. She had expected me to break, but instead she was the one crumbling in front of the people whose approval she craved most. Around us, the evening resumed in fragments. The waiters pretended to be busy but couldn't hide their smirks. One of the guests coughed awkwardly, trying to cut through the tension, but it only made the discomfort thicker. And me? I sat still, composed, watching the empire of arrogance Rebecca had built collapse in a single moment. Ethan still stared at the papers as if they might explode in his hands, while Rebecca's silence screamed louder than any insult she had hurled before. The entire room now saw what I had always known. Sometimes you don't need to fight back with rage or noise. Sometimes all it takes is a signature, a sentence, and the truth laid bare for everyone to witness. Ethan's hand trembled as he tried to slide the papers discreetly back toward Rebecca, but the motion was awkward, clumsy, almost childlike. He looked like a man who had been caught cheating at a game he thought he controlled, only to realize the whole room had seen every move. The guests, who had once been allies in Rebecca's mockery, now whispered openly, their eyes flicking between the two of them like spectators at a slow-motion train wreck. I stayed silent, calm, unmoving, sipping my wine with measured ease as if I were merely an observer, not the centerpiece of the spectacle. That silence, my refusal to rise to their stage, unsettled them all more than any outburst could have. Rebecca leaned toward Ethan, hissing something under her breath, but it was loud enough for those closest to hear. Her attempt to regain control slipped through her fingers like water, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to mask panic with authority. Ethan, red-faced, shook his head, his lips pressed tight as if to avoid digging himself any deeper. The scene was unraveling and neither of them had the skill to hold it together. A guest at the far end of the table let out a low chuckle, quickly stifled, but it spread like a spark to dry grass. Another followed, then another, until scattered laughter peppered the room, each one a nail sealing Rebecca's humiliation. She sat stiffly now, her earlier arrogance crumbling into something brittle and transparent. Her fingers clawed lightly at her wine glass, knuckles white, eyes darting as though searching for an escape route. I kept my gaze steady on her, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with an icy calm that made her shift in her seat. My restraint was louder than any accusation. Ethan tried to salvage what he could by clearing his throat and forcing a strained laugh, as though he could still charm the room back to his side, but it only deepened the awkwardness. "Quite the joke, huh?" he muttered weakly, but no one joined in. His words fell flat, lifeless, echoing in the heavy silence that followed. Someone coughed into their napkin, not to clear their throat but to cover their amusement. The balance had shifted entirely, and they both knew it. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, finally breaking eye contact with me, staring instead at the polished wood of the table as if it might swallow her whole. Her confidence had been her weapon, and now it was shattered glass cutting her from the inside. Ethan's presence beside her no longer looked victorious or defiant. It looked pathetic, an anchor dragging her down in front of everyone. I set my glass down gently, the sound of crystal against wood deliberate, final. The guests quieted immediately, their attention pulled back to me. I looked at Rebecca and then at Ethan, letting the silence hang for several beats before speaking softly but firmly. "I suppose congratulations are in order," I said, my voice smooth, even, carrying to every corner of the room. "You both wanted this moment. Now you have it." No one laughed this time. No one dared. My words weren't delivered with malice, but the weight behind them was undeniable, and the two of them shrank under it. Rebecca finally looked at me again, her lips parting as if to retort, but nothing came out. The tables had turned too completely. Every attempt to claw back control would only expose how little she had left. I leaned back once more, folding my hands on the table, radiating the composure she had expected me to lose. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, pushing the papers further away as though their very presence burned him. He reached for his drink, his hand shaking enough that the glass clinked against the plate before he steadied it. A ripple of whispers moved through the guests again, quieter this time, not laughter but awe, realization, judgment. The room no longer looked at me with pity or amusement. They looked at me with a strange, quiet respect, as if they'd witnessed something they couldn't quite define. Rebecca's smirk was gone, her shoulders tense, her once commanding presence reduced to a woman cornered by her own arrogance. And I sat there, calm, unwavering, knowing the night had only just begun its descent into something neither of them had anticipated. Ethan finally pushed back his chair, the scrape of wood against tile loud enough to make several heads turn. He muttered something about needing air, but before he could stand fully I reached across the table, not to stop him but to gently push the signed papers toward him once again. The gesture was slow, deliberate, undeniable. Every pair of eyes followed the movement, and Ethan froze mid-motion, caught in the act of running away. Rebecca's voice, brittle and sharp, cut through the silence like glass snapping. "Don't touch them," she hissed at him, her mask of control splintering. But the damage was done. The papers lay in front of him like a mirror, reflecting not only his cowardice but their shared betrayal. He sat back down, the fight draining from him, sweat gathering along his hairline. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the restaurant's ventilation, the clink of a fork dropped somewhere in the distance. Rebecca leaned toward him, whispering furiously now, her words venomous yet desperate, but he refused to meet her gaze. His eyes darted around the table instead, searching for allies, but finding only cool amusement, thinly veiled pity, and outright smirks. I sat calmly, my hands folded neatly in front of me, breathing slow and steady. The silence pressed in, heavy, undeniable. Then, as if the universe had conspired with me, the waiter returned. His hands were steady, professional, his expression neutral though his eyes flicked briefly toward the papers. Without a word, I gestured toward Ethan. The waiter, understanding far more than he let on, extended his hand politely. "Sir, I believe these are yours now," I said, my tone as even as if I were asking someone to pass the salt. A ripple moved through the crowd, muffled laughter, whispers, gasps. Ethan recoiled as though I'd handed him a venomous snake, his lips parting in protest, but no sound came out. The waiter, still holding the edge of the folder, waited. The moment stretched long, unbearable. Rebecca slammed her palm on the table, the sound echoing in the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. Her face had drained of color, her lips trembling as she spat. "Stop this! This isn't funny." But it was far too late. The crowd had already decided who was the joke. Ethan's hand trembled as he finally took the folder, his eyes never leaving the floor. The waiter withdrew silently, the smallest hint of a smirk playing at his lips as he disappeared into the kitchen. The room burst into scattered chuckles that quickly grew into outright laughter. Rebecca turned on them, furious, her voice shaking as she demanded, "What are you all laughing at?" But no one answered. Their eyes darted between her and Ethan, then back to me, and their silence was louder than any response. She realized then, in that crushing moment, that she was standing in the ashes of her own fire. I lifted my glass once more, my expression serene. The light caught the wine, casting a ruby glow that seemed to set the scene alight. I looked directly at her, my gaze steady, and spoke in a voice that cut through the noise with quiet precision. "You wanted me humiliated. Instead, you handed me the stage." Her breath hitched, her eyes glassy, her lips pressed tight as if she could physically hold back her shame. Ethan looked no better. Head bowed, shoulders slumped, the folder heavy in his lap like a weight he couldn't put down. Around us, the guests shifted, some with sly smiles, others with open glee. They'd come expecting a spectacle, and they got one, just not the one Rebecca had promised. She sat frozen, her hand clutching the stem of her glass so tightly I thought it might snap, while I calmly finished my drink and set the glass down with care. The sound of crystal on wood was the punctuation mark, the final note in a symphony she had unwittingly composed but I had conducted. I stood then, adjusting my jacket slowly, every motion deliberate, commanding. The room quieted instantly. I let the silence hang for a breath before speaking one last time. "And in that moment," I said softly, almost to myself but loud enough for them all to hear. She understood that silence speaks louder than cruelty. With that, I turned and walked away, my steps steady, unhurried, leaving Rebecca and Ethan stranded in their humiliation while the room buzzed with the aftermath of revelation. And as I left, I knew without a doubt that they would never escape the shadow of that night. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. More twists are waiting just around the corner.